What if the first human civilization didn't just collapse? What if it was wiped out by a nuclear blast in a war between two alien races fighting over who would rule the Earth? Sounds like science fiction, but the people who lived through it wrote it down on clay 4,000 years ago. And those tablets are still sitting in museums today. Every claim in this video traces back to real Sumerian texts and two named modern researchers. We'll get to who they are in a moment. But first, the story itself. The Sumerians, the oldest civilization we know of, did not believe humans were born from this earth. They believed humans were made, engineered, by a race they called the Anunnaki, gods who descended from the sky, built the first cities, and shaped the human form with their own hands. The Anunnaki, according to these texts, came from a dying world, a planet on a long elliptical orbit that swung close to Earth only once every few thousand years, a planet called Nibiru. Their atmosphere was collapsing. They needed gold, not for jewelry, but for survival, to shield what was left of their failing sky. And here is where the story stops sounding like myth and starts sounding like a record. Because the Sumerian King List, a real clay tablet, catalogued today as WB444 in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, does not measure the reigns of these early kings in years. It measures them in a unit called ASAR. 1 SAR equals 3,600 years. And the Anunnaki kings, the tablet says, ruled for 120 SARs each. Do the math. 432,000 years. Mainstream historians call that mythological exaggeration. Ancient astronaut theorists call it a literal record of a non-human lifespan. But the Anunnaki were not the only visitors. Across nearly every ancient culture on Earth, from the Greeks to the Meier, from the indigenous peoples of the Americas to the Aboriginal Dreamtime, there is another race recorded again and again under different names, but with one detail in common. They came from the cluster of stars we now call the Pleiades. The Pleiadians. Where the Anunnaki were power, hierarchy, and control, the Pleiadians were described as the opposite: older, wiser, deeply empathic, fair-haired, blue-eyed beings who, the story says, came to Earth not to use humanity, but to protect it. So picture the scene: the earliest humans just emerging, holding rough stone tools, looking up and seeing two completely different kinds of beings walking the earth alongside them. Beings who could fly, beings who could heal, beings who could build at scales we still cannot replicate today. So humans did the only thing they knew how to do. They worshipped them. But here is where the story turns dark. Because the Anunnaki, according to the Sumerian text known as the Atrahasis Epic, did not see humanity as students. They saw humanity as labor. The Atrahasis tablet, dated to 1700 BC, says plainly, a lower caste of gods called the Igigi rebelled against the Anunnaki rulers, refusing to mine gold any longer. And to end the rebellion, the Anunnaki engineered a new species to take their place in the mines. Us. Built to work. The Pleiadians refused to accept that. They saw a young species worth protecting, a species that deserved freedom. And that disagreement between the race that wanted to enslave humanity and the race that wanted to liberate it is what the modern synthesis of these traditions says sparked the war. Now, before we go any further into that war, you deserve to know exactly where this story actually comes from. Because it does not come from a YouTube comment section. It comes from two completely separate streams of evidence. The Anunnaki side is built on 5 real Sumerian and Babylonian texts: the Sumerian King List, the Atrahasis Epic, the Enuma Elish, the Eridu Genesis, and the Erra Epic. All of them are translated. All of them are in museums. The interpretation that frames the Anunnaki as flesh and blood astronauts from Nibiru comes from one specific researcher, Zecharia Sitchin, who published his translation in 1976. The Pleiadian side comes from a completely different lineage. A Swiss contactee named Billy Meier in 1975 and an American author named Barbara Marciniak, whose 1988 work produced the modern Pleiadian framework. Mainstream Assyriologists reject Sitchin. Mainstream science rejects Meier and Marciniak. The ancient astronaut community treats all 3 as foundational. The truth, as always, is something you will have to decide for yourself. Now, back to the war. The earliest humans, the story says, were caught in the middle of it. Beings in the sky fighting over the species walking the ground. And the Pleiadians, being beings of light and harmony, refused to accept the slavery the Anunnaki had imposed. Which brings us to the strangest piece of evidence in this entire story. The Erra Epic, a real Babylonian text found on cuneiform tablets at Nineveh and Sultan Tepe, describes a god using what the text literally calls 7 terrifying weapons. Weapons that scorched the land, weapons that poisoned the rivers, weapons that left behind a wind, an evil wind, the text calls it, that traveled across the country and killed everything it touched. And there is another real text, the Lamentation over the destruction of Ur, written shortly after the actual fall of the Sumerian city of Ur, around 2000 BC. That lament describes the same thing: an evil wind, a storm with no rain, a force that, in the poet's own words, filled the city like a cloth, enveloped it like a sheet, a radioactive cloud. Mainstream history attributes the fall of Sumer to drought, Elamite invasion, and economic collapse. And those factors are real. But mainstream history cannot fully explain the language. Why does a Sumerian poet, 4,000 years ago, describe the destruction of his city using the exact words a modern survivor would use to describe nuclear fallout? A wind that kills, with no fire, with no enemy in sight. The argument made by Sitchin and the ancient astronaut community is that this was the final battle, the end of the war. A nuclear weapon detonated over the Sinai Peninsula by the Anunnaki in a last attempt to hold the planet, and the fallout carried on the wind, ending the first great civilization on Earth. The history textbooks will tell you Ur fell to Elamites and bad weather, but the texts, the actual cuneiform tablets, sitting in glass cases right now in the British Museum and the Louvre and the Ashmolean, those texts use the language of nuclear war. 3,000 years before nuclear war was supposed to exist. Maybe our ancestors were writing fantasy, or maybe they were writing the only history they had, of a war they were too small to fight, between 2 races they were too young to understand. So here is the question I want to leave you with. If the Anunnaki really did come here, and the Pleiadians really did try to stop them, who do you think actually won? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one.